The real problem, focus is not strength, it's direction. We live in a time when almost everyone believes they lack strength, willpower, discipline, motivation. People wake up tired, try to concentrate, fail, and conclude that there is something wrong with them, that they are weak, that they weren't born with the right mind. But this conclusion is false and dangerous because it distracts you from the real problem. The problem is not a lack of strength, it's a lack of direction. The human mind was not made to remain fixed. The natural state of the mind is movement. Thoughts arise, disappear, return, and overlap. This is not a defect, it is how it functions. The modern mistake is believing that focus means stopping thinking or forcing the mind to obey. When you try to dominate the mind by force, you create tension. And all tension generates resistance, and all resistance drains energy. Ancient warriors knew this, not because they were mystics, but because they lived in environments where mistakes meant real consequences. For a shinobi, a scattered mind didn't cause a drop in productivity. It caused physical collapse. A distraction wasn't a detail, it was a sentence. Therefore, training the mind never began with rigidity. It never began with aggressive control. It began with something much more subtle and more difficult. Perception. You can't control what you don't perceive. You cannot master what you do not recognize. The modern mind fails because it tries to suppress distraction. The ancient warrior trained to see the distraction arise. This is a point that changes everything. When you sit down to work, study, or train and realize your mind has wandered, minutes have usually passed, sometimes dozens of them. The focus wasn't broken in that instant. It was broken much earlier, the moment a small thought arose, and you didn't notice. The mind doesn't break all at once. She's leaking, drop by drop. And here's the truth that almost no one accepts. Distraction is not the enemy of focus. Unconsciousness is. The shinobi didn't train to never be distracted. He trained to immediately perceive when a distraction arose. The difference between an ordinary man and a disciplined man is not the absence of thoughts. It's the speed of awareness. In the modern world, you are rewarded for reacting quickly, but you've never been trained to notice things early. You respond to messages, stimuli, sounds, notifications, but you don't respond to your own mind, and that creates a fragmented life. You start something, he interrupts. Return, it interrupts again. And at the end of the day, you feel tired without having made any progress. True focus doesn't come from effort. It is born from clarity about where your attention is right now. This is the first shock for anyone embarking on the path of mental discipline, realizing that they are not in control, and never were. The mind was on autopilot, guided by impulses, habits, and external stimuli. The real training begins when you accept it without guilt, without shame, without judgment. The warrior doesn't humiliate himself for not yet mastering his mind. He simply begins to train it. And training the mind is not about making it rigid. It's about making it directional. A blade is not strong because it is hard. She is strong because she points in a single direction. While your mind is drawn to many places at once, your life becomes fragmented. You start many things and finish few. You feel the urge to change, but you can't sustain the change. You even understand what you need to do, but you don't stay with it long enough for the transformation to happen. This is the modern state of chronic dispersion. Katana Mental doesn't start by promising absolute focus. It starts with something more honest. Awareness of the leak, because only those who recognize where they are losing energy can learn how to redirect it. Before any technique, before any method, there is a silent question that needs to be asked. Where is my attention focused right now? If you can't answer that clearly, it doesn't matter how many tools you use. Your mind will continue to rule you. And this is just the first step. Every path to discipline begins with a dangerous misconception, believing that talent is enough. Most people who fail don't fail because of a lack of ability. They fail because they confuse potential with mastery. The archetype of the apprentice accurately represents this. He learns quickly, it moves well, it has energy. Are you curious? But it lacks presence. Sora was like that. Not weak, not incapable, On the contrary, his body responded well to training. His mind understood instructions. His potential was visible, but something always failed at the decisive moment. During sword training, his mind would wander. During physical exercise, I thought about others. During the silence, he would fall asleep. During practice, he justified it. This is a perfect portrait of modern man, always one step ahead of his own attention, always living in later. After this is finished, after that is improved, after I have more time. The problem is that mastery doesn't happen afterwards. It happens in now supported. When Sora failed a simple observation test, the impact wasn't physical, it was symbolic. A basic test reveals something essential. If you don't see what's in front of you, you're not present. The master didn't yell, he didn't punish, he didn't humiliate. He simply said something that dismantles any ego. Your mind leaks energy. This sentence doesn't accuse, it describes. Most people waste energy trying to defend themselves from their own failures. The true learner accepts the diagnosis, because only those who accept reality can transform it. A mind that leaks energy is a mind scattered in many places at the same time. It is the mind that thinks about what has already passed or what has not yet arrived. It is the mind that lives projecting, comparing, anticipating. And while it does this, it does not inhabit the body, nor the present moment. Talent without attention creates frustration. Because you feel you could be more, but you can't sustain that more. True training begins when the learner understands that attention is not a detail of the path. It is the path itself. Without it, no technique takes hold. No skill solidifies. No transformation remains. The cloth with the 9 symbols wasn't magic. It was a map. A reminder that the mind needs to be trained in layers. Not in a hurry. Not anxiously. Not to prove anything to anyone. The modern mistake is wanting quick mental results. The warrior trained didn't get lost. That was the initial goal. Not to win, not to impress, just not to mentally disappear in the middle of the process. When Sora tried to focus on the flame and failed, he experienced what every practitioner experiences, the mind wandering without permission. And that is humiliating for the ego, because it reveals that you don't control your own thoughts. But the master did not teach rigidity. He taught something more rare, conscious return. Each time her mind wandered, Sora returned. No anger, no criticism, no drama. This return is the invisible muscle of focus. It's not about remaining forever. It's about returning whenever you lose focus. Most people abandon training because they believe focus is about remaining still, firm, and perfect. When they realize they are failing, they give up. The warrior understands that failure is part of training. It is giving up that destroys the path. Talent without attention turns into anxiety. Talent without presence leads to frustration. Talent without discipline becomes an excuse. The true beginning of mental katana happens when the apprentice accepts a simple, harsh truth. No matter how much you know, if your mind doesn't remain focused, nothing deepens. And as long as nothing goes deeper, you will continue living on the surface of yourself. First principle, Ren. Perceive before controlling. There is a silent error that destroys almost all mental training before it even begins. The attempt to control something that has not yet been understood. Modern man wants immediate mastery. He wants to press an internal button and silence his mind. He wants results without going through the most uncomfortable stage of all, to observe one's own disorder. The first principle of Kujikiri, symbolically called Ren, it doesn't talk about strength, nor power, nor rigid discipline. It talks about perception. It's something that seems simple, but demands brutal honesty, noticing where the attention is going without trying to correct it immediately. Most people believe that focus means keeping your mind fixed, but that's a childish interpretation of the process. Real focus begins long before fixation. It begins the instant you recognize you've lost the thread, and you return. The shinobi knew something the modern world has forgotten. The mind always moves. The problem isn't movement itself. The problem is unconscious movement. When the mind moves and you don't realize it, it begins to govern you. When you become aware of the movement, you regain control. Sora's initial training before the flame wasn't aimed at creating eye rigidity or forced focus. The goal was to train something more subtle, the exact moment when the mind wandered. The second a thought arose. The instant when attention abandoned the present. This moment is invisible to most people. They only realize they're lost when they're already far away, minutes later, sometimes hours. This delay is what destroys focus in modern life. You begin a task, a thought arises, you don't realize. Another thought connects, an emotion arises, an impulse arises. Before you know it, you're somewhere else entirely, physically or mentally. The warrior trained to shorten that interval, to notice the distraction, at birth, not in collapse. This requires a rare kind of attention, an attention that doesn't judge, doesn't react, doesn't blame itself. It simply sees. Here's a disturbing truth. The more annoyed you become by your distraction, the more distracted you become. Anger, frustration, and shame are strong mental stimuli. They hijack attention. In other words, trying to control the mind with aggression only creates more noise. Training of Renit teaches something counterintuitive, returning without conflict. Returning to the point of attention as one returns home, not as one is forcibly pulled back. This gentle return is what strengthens awareness. The ancients didn't talk about willpower, they talked about clarity. A clear mind understands quickly. A confused mind reacts late. This is why modern focus fails. People try to endure long tasks with a fragmented mind. They try to resist mental fatigue without first training their perception. The result is exhaustion without progress. The first principle doesn't make you productive, it makes you present. Presence is a prerequisite for any real performance. When you begin to notice your deviations without drama, something changes. The mind begins to realign itself, not by imposition, but because it has finally been seen. Attention begins to return more quickly. The interval of distraction decreases. Energy stops leaking out. This is the first symbolic cut in Kuji-kiri, cutting the illusion that you control your mind. And by cutting this illusion, paradoxically, you begin to control it. Before trying to master focus, do the one thing almost no one does. Watch yourself lose focus. Not to punish yourself, but to learn the way back. Second principle, PIO, inner anchor. You don't silence the world, you silence yourself. Once the learner begins to notice the distraction, a new problem arises. The excess of stimuli. Sounds, movements, information, noises. The modern world is noisy, but not as much as we believe. The real chaos isn't outside, it's inside. When Sora was taken to the forest and exposed to multiple sounds, his first reaction was the same as anyone would have today: resistance, tension, a desire to escape. The impulse to shut the world down. This impulse is the central flaw of the modern mind. People believe that focus arises when the environment becomes silent. Therefore, they need perfect conditions to work, study, or think. When these conditions don't exist, they give up. The warrior did not depend on ideal conditions. He trained to become the axis. The second principle teaches something essential. You don't control the outside world, but you can choose where your attention rests. As long as your attention is scattered, any stimulus will have power over you. When it anchors itself deeply, the world loses its hold. The master didn't tell Sora to eliminate sounds. He told her to stop feeding them. That difference changes everything. The mind clings to stimuli because it finds something internal in them. Anxiety, fear, curiosity, escape. Noise only dominates when it finds internal resonance. If the inner self is unstable, anything external becomes oppressive. Therefore, the training wasn't about reacting to the sound, but about diving inward. Breathing, body, sensation, physical presence. The anchor wasn't outside. It was in the center. Most people try to fight distractions. Warriors replace distraction with presence. They don't fight the noise. They become denser than it. This principle is brutally relevant today. We live trying to control notifications, people, environments, schedules. But we ignore the only element we can truly train: our own intelligence, inner attention. When you anchor your attention in the body, something powerful happens. Thought loses its power. The mind slows down. Not because it was repressed, but because it found stability. This isn't relaxation. This is grounding. An unanchored mind is pulled by any current. An anchored mind perceives the movement, but is not dragged along. The common mistake is confusing focus with exclusion from the world. True focus includes everything, but clings to nothing. It observes without getting lost. It feels without reacting. This is the state that allows one to work in chaotic environments, to think amidst the noise, to remain whole in hostile contexts. Not because the world has changed, but because the center has been found. The second principle of Kuji-kiri does not teach external silence. It teaches centrality, and whoever finds the center no longer depends on ideal conditions to act. When attention anchors itself deeply, the world can scream. It no longer commands. Third principle, TP. Sit with chaos. The true enemy is within. When the world ceases to dominate your attention, something far more dangerous emerges. A silent, persistent enemy, impossible to avoid. Yourself, old fears, unresolved doubts, anxiety about the future, guilt about the past, desire to prove worth, fear of failure, wounded ego, thoughts that don't scream, but corrode. The third principle of Kuji-kiri is not about external focus. It deals with the war that occurs when there is nowhere left to run. While the noise came from outside, Sora still had an excuse. The wind, the birds, the insects, the forest. But when he was placed in the center of the dojo, surrounded by moving bodies, clashing wood, shouts, and impact, something different happened. The external chaos began to mirror the internal chaos. The body reacted before the mind, heart racing, shortness of breath, instinct screaming to get up, run, protect yourself. This is where almost everyone fails. The human mind is trained to avoid discomfort. When intense emotions arise, the automatic impulse is to distract oneself, rationalize, justify, or flee. Modern man does this all the time. Opens another tab, picks up the cell phone, changes the subject, laughs, complains, procrastinates. The warrior could not escape. He was sitting down. Sit in the storm until the storm loses interest. This phrase sounds poetic, but it's brutally practical. It describes a profound psychological phenomenon. Unsustained emotions dissipate. Suppressed emotions intensify. When you try to silence fear, it grows. When you try to banish anxiety, it returns stronger. When you try to forcefully overcome your thoughts, they multiply. The third principle teaches something radical. Remain. To remain with the discomfort. To remain with the fear. To remain in the heavy silence. Not to suffer, but to get through it. At first, Sora felt like she was going to break. Her body trembled. Her mind created scenarios. Her imagination amplified threats. This stage is familiar to anyone who has tried to meditate seriously, train deep focus, or confront their own emptiness. The mind panics when it realizes it cannot escape. But something happens when you don't give in. The body senses that there is no real danger. The mind begins to slow down. Emotions without fuel lose their power. And then something rare happens, quietude without repression. This is the third symbolic seal. The mind doesn't become silent because it has been mastered, but because it has been understood. You discover that you are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your impulses. They arise, they pass, and you remain. The modern mistake is believing that focus is lost because of external distractions. The truth is harsher. Focus is lost because we don't know how to deal with what we feel when we are present. When you sit with the inner chaos, something reorganizes itself. The mind stops screaming. The body relaxes. Attention stabilizes. Not because everything became easy, but because you stopped resisting. This principle does not create comfort. It creates solidity, and a sound mind doesn't need to run away. Fourth principle, Shay, single intention. Focus is not action, it is decision. After the internal chaos subsides, another, even more subtle challenge arises, the fragmentation of intention. Most people believe they get distracted because the world is chaotic. But the real reason is different. They want to do too many things at once. They want to get it right. They want to please. They want to avoid failure. They want to appear competent. They want to finish quickly. Each desire draws attention in a different direction. The fourth principle teaches something simple and devastating. Attention follows intention. Where intention is divided, focus is broken. When Sora walked across the elevated beams, the test wasn't physical. It was mental. His body knew how to walk. He had the balance. But the moment a thought arose, don't fall. Am I doing this right? Is the master watching? The intention shattered, and his body fell along with it. This is an accurate reflection of modern life. You start something wanting to finish, but also wanting security. You want to grow, but you also want comfort. You want to change, but you also want to maintain your image. This division creates internal tension, and this tension destroys focus. The warrior has no ulterior motives. He chooses one and abandons the rest. Training based on the fourth principle doesn't involve strength. It involves absolute internal commitment, not in an emotional sense, but in a decisional one. It's the silent decision to do something wholeheartedly, even with fear, even without guarantees, even without applause. Therefore, each task required of Sora had one thing in common. It allowed no hesitation. Walking, memorizing, climbing, throwing. The instant the mind questioned, the flow was broken. Focus does not originate from thought. It stems from a sustained choice. The modern mind lives in a constant state of negotiation with itself. Just a little longer. I'll come back later. Now is not the time. Each negotiation creates a micro-rupture in intention, and multiple micro-ruptures build a fragmented life. The fourth principle teaches us to align intention and action. When you choose something, you engage with it. When you finish, you move on, without carrying over mental residue from one moment to the next. This is the birth of the flow state, not as something mystical, but as a natural consequence of an undivided mind. As long as your intentions are scattered, you will live weary, not because of what you do, but because of the constant internal conflict. When intentions become unified, effort diminishes, clarity increases, time seems to cooperate. A clear intention creates a clear life. Weak intentions lead to chronic distraction. This is the fourth cut in Kuji Kiri, cutting indecision. Not through haste, but through the courage to choose one path at a time. Fifth principle, Kai. The mental block. When the mind stops negotiating. There comes a point in mental training where the problem is no longer distraction, fear, or hesitation. The problem becomes something more subtle and more dangerous. The excess of possibilities. The mind starts working too well. It perceives, feels, chooses. And that's precisely why it starts negotiating. This is the point where many believe they have mastered focus, and it is precisely there that they lose it. The fifth principle, symbolically called, when it does not represent aggressive control. It represents closing. The ability to close the mind's door to everything that is not essential at that moment. Up to this point, Sora had learned to perceive distractions, to anchor himself internally, to sit with the chaos, and to unify his intention. But something still pulled him away from his center. Residual thoughts, parallel ideas, subtle expectations. His mind no longer shouted. It whispered, and whispers are more dangerous than shouts. When the mind screams, you realize. When she whispers, you get distracted without noticing. A mental block is not tension. It's not rigidity. It's not closing your eyes to the world. It's an internal decision to do not negotiate with irrelevant thoughts. That's when the mind understands that there's no room for debate. Modern man lives in constant negotiation with himself. He starts something and, at the first sign of discomfort, opens an internal conversation. Maybe later. Is it worth it? What if I do it another way? This conversation drains energy, not because of the content, but because of the conflict. The warrior does not negotiate during the action. He chooses beforehand. When Sora was instructed to maintain a single point of focus, the weight of the stone in his hands, something fundamental happened. His mind tried to pull him away with seemingly harmless thoughts: hunger, tiredness, doubt, self-image, comparison. But every time he yielded even slightly, the state broke. The fifth principle teaches something unsettling. Not every thought deserves attention. The modern mind has been trained to hear everything. The warrior was trained to hear only what mattered. This is not repression, it's hierarchy. A mind without hierarchy is chaotic. Everything has the same weight. Everything competes. Everything drains. When you establish a central focus, the rest naturally loses strength. This is the real mental block. Not forcibly blocking thoughts, but taking away their permission to govern your attention. In the modern world, this translates simply and brutally. When you decide to do something, you no longer question whether you should be doing something else. You go all in. When you're finished, you come out whole. This state creates something rare. Mental economy. You expend less energy because you don't live in internal conflict. The body relaxes. The mind aligns. Focus becomes almost automatic. A mental block isn't something you activate. It's something that happens when you stop dividing yourself. Few people reach this stage because it requires emotional maturity. It requires accepting that you can't do everything at once. It requires letting go of the illusion of total control. But those who learn to close their minds to the irrelevant discover something liberating. Silence is not emptiness. It is power. Sixth principle, Jin. Expanding attention, perception beyond the self. When most people talk about focus, they imagine something narrow. A tunnel, a thin line of attention directed at a single point. This view is limited and paradoxically fragile, because the narrower the attention, the easier it is to break it. The sixth principle, hearing it, reveals something counterintuitive. The deepest focus doesn't shrink, it expands. Up until now, Sora had trained to remain still, to not get lost, to sustain an intention, to block out the irrelevant. Now, something new was required: to perceive without searching, to feel without looking, to be attentive without tension. When the arrows began to cut through the air, Sora didn't react with thought. He didn't calculate trajectories. He didn't anticipate rationally. He was simply present, and that presence became a field. This is where the modern mind goes astray, because we've been trained to believe that attention is effort, that being attentive means narrowing the eyes of consciousness. But excessive effort creates rigidity, and rigidity creates peripheral blindness. The warrior trained the opposite. Relaxation alert. A relaxed mind perceives more. A tense mind sees less. The sixth principle teaches us to dissolve the rigid center of the self and allow attention to naturally distribute itself throughout the environment. This is not distraction. It is broad perception. It is when you feel the space, the movement, the intention, before they become action. In the modern world, this manifests as context reading, emotional perception, anticipating problems, the ability to sense when something is about to get out of control before it explodes. Most people react too late. The warrior notices early. When your attention span expands, something curious happens. You don't need to move as much. You don't need to think as much. The answers come almost on their own. Not because you've become faster, but because you've noticed them sooner. This state doesn't stem from anxiety. It stems from stable presence. A fragmented mind cannot expand its attention. It's already too busy fighting with itself. That's why hearing it only emerges after the mental block. First you close internal doors, then you open the external field. This expansion creates a strange sensation for those who have never experienced it. The world seems slower, not because time has changed, but because your perception has accelerated. You begin to notice micro-movements, subtle intentions, changes in rhythm. That's why experienced warriors seemed impossible to surprise. They weren't on constant alert. They were gifts. In everyday life, this principle completely transforms your relationship with work, relationships, and decisions. You sense when something is out of alignment. You perceive tensions before they escalate into conflict. You act proactively instead of trying to put out fires. Expanded attention doesn't create anxiety. It creates calm. Because you're no longer chasing after the world. You are with it. This is the sixth symbolic seal, when the focus ceases to be a point and becomes a field. When the mind stops fighting to control and begins to fully inhabit. Seventh principle, Retsu. When time bends, the mind that walks between moments. There is a phenomenon that almost every human being has experienced at least once in their life, but that few understand. A moment when everything seems to slow down. The body reacts before thought. Action arises effortlessly. There is no hesitation, no noise, no internal dialogue. Just precise movement. Most people call it luck. Others call it talent. The warriors knew it was something else. Absolute presence. The seventh principle, symbolically called Retsu, he doesn't talk about physical speed. He talks about perceptual density. When the mind is fully integrated, the brain processes more information per second, not because it has become more intelligent, but because it has stopped wasting energy on internal conflict. The world doesn't slow down. You accelerate from the inside. When Sora faced multiple opponents at once, something curious happened. He didn't see isolated attacks. He didn't think about specific defenses. He perceived spaces, intervals, gaps between actions. Where others saw chaos, he saw structure. This is the direct effect of a non-fragmented mind. The average person lives with a perceptual delay. They only realize the problem when it's already too big. They react when the tension has already exploded. They decide when their options have already dwindled. They always live one step behind the present. The warrior lives one step ahead. This principle teaches something crucial. Deep focus reorganizes the perception of time. When you're not internally negotiating, when you're not fighting with yourself, when you're not divided between the past and the future, the present becomes vast. And in this expanded present, there is room to act with precision. Modern science calls this subjective time dilation. In situations of high presence, the brain accesses different processing states. Noise decreases. Redundancy disappears. The mind enters coherence. But the ancients didn't need a laboratory to understand this. They saw it on the battlefield. A distracted man is slow, even if he runs. A present man is quick, even when standing still. In modern daily life, this principle is extremely rare because we live overloaded. Multitasking, conflicting thoughts, unresolved emotions, social expectations. All of this consumes mental bandwidth. The result is a life lived in a state of delay. When you enter Retsu, something changes radically. You no longer react to stimuli. You respond to the context, and that's a brutal difference. Reaction is automatic. Response is conscious, even when rapid. This state doesn't stem from adrenaline. It stems from clarity. People who live in anxiety believe they are switched on. In reality, they are confused. True focus is calm, silent, economical. That's why experienced warriors seemed cold. Not because they didn't feel, but because they didn't waste emotional energy. At work, Retsu, it manifests when you resolve problems before they become crises. In relationships, when you notice tensions before they turn into conflict. In personal life, when you sense that something is out of alignment before it collapses. This principle transforms your relationship with time. You stop chasing after it and start moving ahead. But there is a price. To live in this state, you need to let go of the need for absolute control. You need to trust in presence. You need to accept that overthinking is a form of delay. Most people are not willing to do that. They prefer the familiar noise of a racing mind to the demanding silence of mindfulness. The seventh cut of Kujikiri doesn't teach you how to beat time. It teaches you to inhabit the moment with such completeness that time loses its power over you. Eighth and ninth principles, ZY plus Zen. Death of identity and effortless focus, the end of the path. There comes a point in mental training where all techniques begin to become obstacles, where even the desire to focus turns into a distraction. This is the most dangerous and most misunderstood territory on the path. The eighth principle, symbolically called Zayat, doesn't talk about improving the mind. It talks about abandon the structure that creates noise identity. While you try to be someone, your mind falls apart. While you're trying to prove something, your attention is divided. While you define yourself, you limit yourself. Identity is necessary for living in society. But at the deepest level of presence, it becomes a burden. Expectations arise, internal narratives are activated, fear of failure emerges, the desire to maintain an image interferes. Sora had to face the most uncomfortable question of all. Who am I without thought? This question dissolves everything that is false. Name, role, past, ambition, label. All of that exists on the social plane, but not on the plane of pure consciousness. And as long as you cling to those layers, there will always be something pulling your attention away from the present moment. The death of identity is not literal. It's functional. It's learning to act without carrying the weight of who you think you are. When that happens, the mind becomes light, and a light mind is not easily distracted. It is at this point that the ninth principle naturally emerges. It was. Zen is not about extreme concentration. It's not maximum effort. It's not rigidity. Zen is effortless focus. It is when the mind is so free of internal conflicts that attention rests solely on what is happening. There is no one trying to focus. Focus simply happens. The modern mistake is trying to achieve Zen as a goal, but while you're trying to get there, you're already out of it. Zen emerges when the search ends. The final symbol, the empty box, represents this perfectly. There is nothing to add. There is no final technique. There is no hidden secret. Emptiness is not absence. It is freedom. When Sora entered that state, the master bowed, because there was nothing left to teach. Not because Sora had become superior, but because he had stopped fighting against himself. This is the true conclusion of Kujikiri. And here's the brutally honest application for the modern world. You don't need any more motivation. No more methods are needed. No more promises are needed. You need to stop dividing yourself. Where does your mind still fragment? Where do you still trade? Where are you still trying to control instead of being present? The mental katana doesn't promise an easy life. It promises an aligned mind. And an aligned mind transforms any path into firm ground. The most focused version of you isn't in the future. She's on the other side of the distraction, on the other side of fear, on the other side of the identity you insist on maintaining. Trim off the excess, sharpen your presence, and walk whole. If this path spoke to you, it's not out of curiosity. It's because your mind is ready to stop running away. Write in the comments, "Today, I sharpen my mind." Sign up for Katana Mental if you're not looking for motivation, but interior domain. Until the next cut, keep your mind sharp, maintain a firm presence, and don't negotiate with distraction.